So to get some sort of introduction, because it was also obvious that people tended to be more confused than actually clear about what subjecthood is and why one would attend a workshop on this and so on and so forth. So I've just, done this sort of work of looking at literature and at different concepts that are similar to subjecthood, and that we could maybe apply in order to theorize subjecthood and use it as a entry point for critical social inquiry, as we want to do in this workshop. I just give a brief outline of this first session. So I will do three things. I will try to situate the concept of subjecthood. I will sketch out what might be an archaeology of subjecthood, so how can we actually study subjecthood, how can we trace it, and briefly talk about problems and limitations. And then Dr. Lucy Rosova, who's here next to me, kindly agreed to provide us with a perspective of applied subjecthood study with her empirical material, which is situated in Egypt in the late colonial and the current time. And we are very grateful that Lucy joined us, because it does appear a bit abstract, a concept, but as I'll try to show, it's actually not. And it's also a concept that can help us to understand a lot of research that has been done so far. So situating the concept, I try to do this through just looking at twin concepts or similar concepts. And the first concept would be the one of personhood. And here I came across one book, Neoliberalism, Personhood and Post-Socialism, which does trace subjecthood in a very interesting way, because it looks at ethnographic, so it provides ethnographic explorations of people in Eastern Europe during the time of transition from socialist into a supposedly capitalist market democracy. And it basically looks at how people had to basically constitute a new self. They had to say, oh well, now we're, communism has fallen and we'll have to become sort of market people, homo economicus or whatever you want to call it. So they had to sort of develop this entrepreneurial subjecthood or personhood, and the authors of this collection actually trace this, how they sort of make this shift and how they maybe accept but also subvert these practices. And this of course comes with a sort of wave of teleological thinking that, market mechanism and market-driven economics is the sort of new way of life, also for Eastern Europe. So here we see how personhood is a sort of state of being, or it's a status, so it sort of implies something static. But of course this edited collection then looks at it from an ethnographic perspective, and how basically this is a practice, it is enacted, it is fluid, it is very maybe also complex. The next point would be the idea of subjectivity or subjectivities. So of course this is a term that we do use in sort of philosophy of social science and so on and so forth. I just briefly flag up another example here, Politics of Modern Muslim Subjectivities, which is again a collection that looks at basically people's viewpoints or worldviews, or maybe with a bigger authority claim at their realities as opposed to our realities, as it were. So the idea basically to not just theorize, social processes in a macro way or in a very aggregate way, but really look at the people. But then, of course, the question is, how do you discern subjectivities or worldviews from social and external influences? So how does intersubjectivity shape these sort of subjective worldviews? So this just as briefly flagging it up. The next concept, the self, so the whole sort of field of psychoanalytical, socio-psychological and so on studies. People in this field we couldn't really attract to this workshop, so maybe that would also be something for future events, if any, to actually have this discussion, which we didn't manage to actually really initiate, also not for the keynote, unfortunately. And so how is the self constituted in time, materiality, space and discourse, and how is self-other distinction and self formation, how can it be studied? So of course Freud, Klein, Lacan, but also for example Giddens are possible people on whom we could draw here, and and what we will maybe, one direction which we will go is for example, things like cultural trauma, on which Jeffrey Alexander and others have written, or the memory of politics, or memory politics, on which Jenny Atkins has written. So the way in which political processes are sort of driven by identity and what we would call subjecthood. Yeah, I would like to make also another specific example in this case, but I'll really make it brief because we're already running out of time. So basically in Divided Subjects, Invisible Borders, Van Gogh is looking at the German reunification and how basically we have a subjecthood formation here through the process of historiography and historical writing, and basically the the public discourse on, well, what was the GDR and what should be done about it and so on. And yeah, he basically shows how this can also lead to estrangement, because for people, a cognitive dissonance ensues where maybe they were part of a system, but in a new reunified country, the system is declared a totalitarian system, is declared maybe a criminal system, and so on and so forth. So how do they cope basically with being complicit or being part of that older, overcome system, which is now sort of being declared as this thing? And then you have very complex processes of people sort of acquiescing to this, but silently challenging it, and so on and so forth. And yeah, and just one sort of quote at the end. So this organicity is seductive, but it can occlude the trauma and difficulty of individual and collective histories. So the sort of epistemic violence of historiography as a problem that we can look at from a socio-psychological perspective. Yeah, so we can sort of use different social scientific concepts like identity or cultures in order to operationalize subjecthood and look at it then in different dynamics like conflict, transition, or change generally. And one crucial entry point that we've also hinted at in the abstract is the link between subjecthood and agency. So usually, or very often, social scientists or people who do social inquiry talk about agency. And then we could, for example, ask, well, if someone acts or if someone is supposed to have agency, are they also subjects, and does it work the other way, and so on. I'm just indicating this because I don't want to get deeper into a theoretical discussion. Yeah, but also we'll have to deal with certain problems, so resistance, inconsistency, and so on and so forth. So just keeping this problem in mind. Just to get to the archaeology, so basically the idea, well, how can we actually trace subjecthood, how can we look at subjecthood, really once again drawing on everything that is already out there and basically just repackaging social science research, so we can look how subjecthood is linked in discourse, or how it is produced through discourse, and how it is then constituted, reproduced, and so on. Practice, and then the link between practice and discourse are interesting things to look at. And of course, Lucy's presentation will sort of enlighten us as to how maybe subjecthood is constituted through certain practices or through certain also visual material, for example. Also, law and legal text, a very interesting point. That's why we're really happy to have also law scholars among the panelists to explore this sort of issue. So in law, we have a wholly different sort of, I would suppose, relation between text and practice. So it's a whole separate universe, which I won't discuss now, once again, for time reasons. And yeah, so the core problem then is, though, how is subjecthood then significant or meaningful or relevant for social inquiry? Why would we even bother, using it as a tool in social inquiry? So of course we have to ask, well, how is a certain kind of subjecthood socially, politically, otherwise relevant or meaningful, and how is it constituted? And then to come to the problems and limitations. This thing doesn't react so quickly. Right. So yeah, a lot of, or at least a bit of research has been done on double consciousness in social psychology and sociology. So the question, well, what if people either consciously or even unconsciously act in different ways and in inconsistent ways, if they contradict themselves, what do we do as researchers about this, right? What do we do if the next day they contradict something that they said this day, or they just can't, make sense of the world in the way we do? And of course, works by Scott or maybe also Fanon are instructive here. And I've also explored this in a little blog post on the Visa Colonial, Post-Colonial, Decolonial webpage. So basically asking, well, if everything is so fragmented and so inconsistent and so on, is there even a possibility of one sort of consistent kind of subjecthood, in this case a decolonial subjecthood, which we will discuss on one panel today. And of course, just to briefly flag it up, the ontological turn in anthropology and social sciences more widely, what do we do about that? Would we even want to engage with that in a discussion on subjecthood? So what constitutes knowledge, and how appropriate are academic research methods and mediums of knowledge production and dissemination in order to actually explore subjecthood or any other topic? And how much can we trust their applicability across cultural contexts? So of course in other cultural contexts we have the issue, well, does it really hold? But then even maybe within our own context, with the emergence of big data and all the other great things, this might be tricky. And one point that I also wanted to specifically flag up doing research in Central Asia is the sort of global epistemic fragmentation of the world into different info spaces. So you have the sort of Anglo-American academia with all the journals and all the sort of academic discourse that is being produced. And you have sort of other informational spaces which speak other languages which don't really have access to this Anglo-American space. So there's a lot of room for arbitrage and a lot of sort of moral hazard in terms of, well, what data do you gather, how do you repackage it, and how do you use it in order to produce research that you can then sell in the Anglo-American info space. Again, that's not specific to subjecthood, but a wider issue. But maybe we could use subjecthood in order to sort of critically look at this. So yeah, the political economy of knowledge production and the sort of incentives we get today as academics. The key term of ref was already mentioned. Those are probably very important issues that we might discuss later in the thinking space. So now we will hear more of an applied perspective. Of course, questions are welcome probably after the presentations. I hope I managed to clarify more than confuse. And then I would like to thank Lucy and ask her to the floor. I'll just open this for you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this wonderful introduction that made me think it's really interesting. And I love the expression archaeology subject. Subjecthood. So I guess I'll give you guys a snapshot of such archaeology. Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Abina, for inviting me. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Does this work? Okay. I was asked at the last minute to present a brief snapshot from my work, which broadly evolves around the construction of modernity or formations of local vernacular modernity and middle-class culture in modern Egypt. And so the technologies of the self that I mention in my title, or to which I refer in my title, of course refer to practices, things people do. And the range of things that people do to constitute themselves as historically and socially situated subjects is of course potentially infinite. It involves, as Philip was mentioning, discursive practices, institutional practices, but also spatial practices. And I think a lot of them will be addressed through the workshop. So what I will present very briefly today is about two types of practices, writing and picture making, which are the subject of my two ongoing research projects. As historians, we are now long past the time when we had to argue that Euro-American or so-called Western modernity was not the only possible modernity. So I am not here today to argue or to prove that Egyptians have been modern 100 years ago. Where my work as a cultural historian fits is rather in seeing how does this local vernacular modernity work in everyday contexts. And how did people a century ago make themselves modern, in this case through practices such as writing certain types of texts or snapping pictures of themselves. So this is Hosni. He was born in 1926 in the provincial city of Fayoum. Hosni was a student in Cairo during the mid-1940s. He was educated and roughly middle class. Like so many other young men of his generation, Hosni wrote a diary, composed scrapbooks, and snapped a lot of pictures of himself and his friends, which he then composed into albums. Hosni's papers fall within a broader context of vernacular photographic and diary writing practices that flourished among modernity-claiming, middling urban Egyptians in the early decades of the 20th century, marking a wider shift towards novel forms of selfhood at this period. So this is one of Hosni's longer diaries. It's a journal from a trip to Upper Egypt. Actually, it's two different journals. The journal I'm talking about is on the right. The text is a lyrical, deeply introspective and existential contemplation on time and existence, on love and marriage. What is love, and what are women supposed to be like? He cites from books he's read, from Balzac to Manfaluti, who was a romantic Egyptian writer of the time, in an attempt to analyze his own love story, a relationship to his fiancée. We don't know any details, because Hosni never explains anything. He clearly does not write for anyone but himself. The diary, however, is one of blame and emotional torment. He complains repeatedly of his girlfriend's failure to respond to his emotions and to make him happy. He writes an entry almost every day, sometimes even twice a day, examining the drama from all kinds of angles. The diary's plot is Hosni's emotional drama, as I said, but the real focus, however, is on himself. So in many ways, what is most remarkable about Hosni's diary is that he wrote it. We have here a young man sitting down alone almost every evening, contemplating the meaning of his existence on a piece of paper. Hosni is convinced that he needs to write in order to understand his life, and he spends much of his free time analyzing his soul, which he treats as an object separate from the writing self. On the slide you see here, in this diary, he actually speaks of himself in the third person when he also draws himself, because he's an art student. Right. Hosni's diary is very similar to other such artifacts that I have been finding in Cairene flea markets over the past roughly 15 years. They mark an entirely novel relationship to texts, a historically novel perception of what texts are for and who can write and write what. In the older textual tradition, which was an oral tradition, texts, or better, words, were embodied, personalized, and linked to or carried by specific people. They were firmly anchored in social contexts. Every genre of text had its appropriate place among people, defined by age and gender and social occasion. Not only was an introspective diary such as Hosni's a novel textual genre, or novel literary genre if you want, but the whole idea of young people writing prose was new. In the early 20th century, it was also considered transgressive and disapproved of as mere nonsense. And because social authority was embedded in, or better overlapped with, the authority of texts, the shifts in the textual authority, of which Hosni's diaries are just one example, were also paralleled by shifts in social and political authority, such as the emergence of different forms of politics and the rise of youth politics. But let me go back to Hosni. In the same introspective tone of Hosni's diary dominates also his photo albums. Hosni uses snapshots the same way he uses his diary to describe his mental states, his moods, his dreams, and his desires. Some of the pages contain references to specific novels he's read or romantic dramas of the silver screen. Hosni poses in a boat, on a shore, in a park, on a tree, and so on, always accompanying the images with sarcastic or poetic captions, like here, for example, in The Sea of Passion. Some of these pages cryptically suggest that he may have been in love. This could have been the same love story that he has described in his diary, but because I don't know the exact dating of the two artifacts, it could also be an entirely fictional love story going on here in the album. Egyptian autobiographies of this period speak of young men longing to love and looking for the right girl to whom extend the emotions they have cultivated independently through reading romantic novels or watching films like those that Hosni has been alluding to. Okay, let me see. skip this. So a particular historical self emerges here through the practices deployed to narrate itself, photographing, composing albums, or writing or composing certain kinds of texts. Hosny uses both narrative devices, textual and visual, to exteriorize, objectify, and literally dissect his self, this object that is his soul, a soul that becomes an object in his writing and in his pictures. This type of introspective writing, marked by a split between a writing self and a written self, or a self, quote, divided against itself in the act of observing and being, end of quote, is well known to scholars of comparative literature. It is a key marker of modern texts in the Euro-American tradition, from autobiography to Victorian letter writing. Clearly, it is a key marker of formations of modernity globally. Vipesh Chakrabarty, for instance, writing about Indian modernity, speaks of just such disembodied, abstracted self available for occupation by anybody. And such disembodied epistemology, which Philip mentioned, was a key trait to modernity, as well as a key fiction through which modernity sustains itself, as a number of scholars have pointed out. Bruno Latour and others insisting on historicizing the subject-object relationship that we today take for granted, or that we have been taking for granted for many, many decades, maybe centuries. The idea that humans are omnipotent actors and that there is an objective world out there that is both knowable and controllable. Instead, what is being proposed in the newer kind of scholarship, the social world is more apprehensible as an assemblage in which people and objects may flow into each other and mutually constitute each other. And I think the diary in Hosny's case and his albums are very much part of who he is. And I will return to this in the very end, which is soon, I guess. Photography and writing work in Hosny's examples in very similar ways as technologies of the modern self, maybe the key technologies through which people make themselves into modern subjects in this period. The modern self must be represented in order to exist. And this is important because representation is key to the construction of modern selfhood, as a number of authors put it. As Timothy Mitchell, for instance, famously put it, formations of modernity construct the world as a picture, and this world as a picture demands a spectator. The world as a picture is typically positions the person as the subject for whom the social world exists, as a view to be observed, an experience to be had, a set of meanings to be interpreted, or a code to be followed or deciphered. The non-modern is unable to represent, unable to symbolize, unable to produce abstract representations, unable to produce spectatorial distance, and therefore unable to constitute itself as a subject. And in another addition to this, under the influence of the mass media, or of what I would rather call, given the possibilities offered by modern media, selfhood comes to be understood as something fashioned by staging one's life as a story, in a continuous representation of oneself, and to others. So it is crucial to understand, however, that this self is less reflected or represented in the picture or in the text, as it is rather realized through these narrative acts, through practices such as writing and diary making or photo album making. Or put differently, it is not representation as such that matters, but the act of representing. And as I will argue right now, one must do it again and again because the world, the modern self, cannot be contained in a single picture. As I have already mentioned, Hosny's albums follow a vibrant tradition of vernacular photography and album making in Egypt that was, by the 1940s, when he was making them, already several decades old. Middling Egyptians have been patronizing photographic studios since the last decades of the 19th century. The studios were at first pricey, but by World War I, there were hundreds of affordable studios in popular neighborhoods in major cities across Egypt. Studio became sites of social performance, in which people enacted ever-multiplying versions of themselves, enacted their desires and their ideal selves. The studio became a performance space, a stage for social improvisation and subversion. Most commonly, as you see here, these are versions of what was imagined then, or what was perceived as being versions of the modern bourgeois selfhood. The visual conventions that I'm briefly alluding to on this slide are a matter of networked and rhizomic cultural flows rather than any kind of simple westernization. I'm happy to develop on this later. So as I'm drawing to my final part, this contrast, what I was just showing you, contrasts sharply with earlier perceptions of visual representation or portraiture in which a single image should capture the soul and character of the sitter. And the early idea that a single image can capture both an entire likeness and presence of a person. Instead, what you see here are distinctly modern performances in which the self is split into potentially infinite number of versions, and where the very point of portraiture is to capture all possible or imagined selves. By the 1930s, portable Kodak cameras were widely available to Egyptians on middling budgets, and snapping photographs at home became widely popular. Especially among middle-class youth, photographic seances at home became widely popular and widely practiced. What you see here on my slide are some of the more remarkable examples. For instance, here, women cross-dressing as men. Okay, so these are slides from a woman's album, and I hope you can see, especially these two pictures. These are young ladies putting on male clothes, if you want. This was actually very common in Egypt as well as Lebanon in the 1920s and 30s. Now, as, for example, another favorite visual trope was dressing up as an Oriental woman. This was an entire fantasy that was known to these middle-class women, probably through Hollywood and Egyptian cinema, because this was sort of an example of these cultural flows that I mentioned earlier. Right. So, very quickly, running through some more examples of these albums. There is a lot to be said about these albums and the practices on which they were part, because photographs as well as texts were of course always part of other practices. They never stand alone, they are never just pictures, but rather objects enmeshed in networks of doing and telling. Taken in themselves, they are fictions made of choices, selections, and omissions. They sanitize, for example, all culturally unstable references and create a particular vision of a young middle-class masculinity or femininity. Oops. Understood within the practices of circulation in acts of hiding or sharing, because they are meant to be hidden from some people, shared with others, and so on, they speak of how patriarchy and individualism construct each other. For example, they sanitize their seniors. The family does not exist in these pages. So these albums allowed young people to articulate alternative subject positions as self-consciously modern individuals in some contexts, while simultaneously perpetuating relations of patriarchy in other contexts. So I think I've probably run out of time, so just to finish on my very final point, it is not only that representation is key to modernity, as Tim Mitchell and others pointed out, but rather formations of modernity both enable and require the constant multiplication of representation. And modern self can never be fitted into a single frame. It must be represented again and again. This is why I think that photographic albums become so incredibly globally popular during this period of high modernity, if you want. Albums and later platforms such as Facebook probably allow to complete the self by bringing together its ever-multiplying versions, which, being photographic, are perceived as always true, but never quite complete. As they also allow the representation of the relationships, because the self is, of course, never singular and bounded. It always spills into other persons. But again, it is not the representations as such that matter, but rather the representational practices through which historical selves are constituted. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lucy. Really interesting. And finally, I can make a bit more sense of why people post so many pictures all the time. Right. So, yeah, we basically have 15 minutes until officially the next panel should start. In any case, I would suggest we just take a few questions and see how it goes, and then maybe see if we have a brief break, but don't get too delayed with the next panel, because we have another participant who is coming via video, so we might not be that flexible. But yeah, floor is open, so please, any questions or any remarks that you would like to make. Maybe from back to front, Gareth, Nick, Hakim.
Thank you very much, both. I've never come across this topic or terminology before, so they're probably quite basic things. I'm wondering where this fits within collective identity, so whether it's photographs of individuals or writing about yourselves as an individuals, positioning yourselves within a group of people, presumably is part of the point. So the collective, I'm not sure, is coming out.
Should we take a few, yeah?
Sure.
Nick?
Thank you very much. My question is more for Lucia, and that's really interesting following all this. I'm just wondering, have you tried to see in Egypt what really happened with Osni? Or, you know, is this something that you're interested in? Or maybe not, because actually it's, you know, it's also interesting to look at what, you know, the image is in itself, but it would be also interesting to have, you know, a little bit of more kind of information about his real life in the sense of how this ended up. And I'm just wondering about this. I'm always personally a little bit uncomfortable with this division of unmodern and modern. Mm-hmm. You also use Latour, so I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile the two? Because for Latour, obviously, you know, we've always been modern or we've never been modern, you know, one of the two, depending on how you look at things. But in any case, this kind of boundary division, this kind of creation of there was a before, there was an after, can actually also lead to different types of arguments. I'm not saying that you do use this, but this type of arguments, but I'm just wondering, like, for instance, representation also existed before modern photography, and of course, this kind of multiple representations of, say, the elite or the aristocracy also existed before photography. So I'm just wondering if we are not making this kind of artificial boundary to...
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely brilliant question, thank you.
Hakim, you still want to then Kate?
Yeah, thank you for that very incisive presentation. My questions are quite basic. First, how did you get these pictures? And secondly, who are the photographers? So, I think it could tell us something else. I think there could be an interesting thing to be learned as to who were in charge of these studios. Are they Egyptians? How did they see themselves in all of this, as it were? So, because I think it's some sort of acting going on, a representation of society and identity. So that's my question.
Maybe do you want to reply before we run out of paper and memory space, and then Kate?
Yeah, mine is actually kind of tackled
okay.
to this
then.
one. Yeah. Listening to what you said, this sort of the aspirational self kept coming into my mind. You know, you're sort of saying these are photos and texts in which people create a distance in a way between their bodily experience and this space of interrogation. You know? And the images that they created themselves are particular. So they're interrogating the self, but also what is their aspiration for that self? I don't know if that quite makes sense, but that's, you know, we often talk about texts being constitutive of social relations, so what is it that they're aiming to constitute? Beyond being a modern self, what is it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it's
absolutely.
more or less a similar version.
It's all the things that I had to leave out of the paper.
Right.
It's like a skeleton, right? Yes, of course. So I will try to, yes, answer. Shall I go ahead?
Yeah,
I don't think I can do anymore. But I will probably answer in how I feel the logical progression of the question. So I'll start from Hakim's question, which is where the pictures come from. They come from flea markets. Most of them come from flea markets, and many of them, well, I have two methods of working over the past 15 years. I've been collecting this material 15 years ago, it was possible to collect it in large quantities. Now it's no longer possible because it has been commercialized and things are basically snapped by collectors. Anyway, so that's one method of working. The other method of working alongside is that I do oral histories and I look at private collections. So that's when it comes with stories and ethnography, basically. Who are the photographers? Well, the photographers, as I mentioned in my paper, when it comes to studios, the photographers are many, many different local Egyptian studios, of which there were hundreds and hundreds in the 1920s and 30s. But these are studios. But what even more? So there are two genres. The other genre is, of course, personal photographs, snapped with home-owned cameras, home-owned Kodaks or other types of consumer cameras, which, as I was saying, became widely affordable again in the war period. And the point, I think, in the sort of larger project I'm doing, I'm really killing the photographer. The photographer really is not important as an institution. It's people who snap themselves, if you want. So anyone can be the photographer. And so it's doing, I think this links to the first question about individual and collective. This is the kind of practices, or sort of the part of the project film, which is very much about practices, things that people do in small groups. And thank you for the question, because of course what's obvious in these two examples, in these two parallel tracks on which I'm working, is that the writing is a very isolated practice, if you want. It's really a very sort of, isolated practice. Because the diary was not meant to be read, including his closest friends or fiancé. It's absolutely obvious. Whereas these photographic practices are precisely the kind of practices that constitute collective subjects. And specifically with the albums, the way this works, it's a particular genre of albums that I think that has not received as much attention by cultural historians and historians of photography, because the focus has always been on family albums. But actually, when you look more closely at this sort of high period of album making, which, as I mentioned, was very global, it is less family, it's more young people taking pictures of themselves. And so what happens there is a sort of, if you want, a sort of constitution of a sort of young peer selves, generational selves. The albums are strongly gendered. They are either all male or all female. And it's not about the albums. The albums are only a small part, if you want, of a whole sort of set of practices that both preceded and followed the making of these photographs. Okay, so these young people hanged out together in their leisure time, and taking pictures was part of the fun they had together. Okay, so for the women it would be the cross-dressing or posing, actually, so much posing. For men it would be, expectedly slightly more active, so it would be actually lots of sports, okay, in outdoor places. And so these would be the practices, as I said, of which photograph making was there. And then the self, of course, constitutes, or these sort of collective selves constitute themselves through all these practices together, of course. And then through the practices of sharing. The albums were always meant to be shared only within this small group of friends who snap each other, okay? And often very much hidden from parents, by the way. They were not meant to be shared with social seniors, and they often, anyway, I can develop on this, but I think I don't have the time. What happens with Hosni, because, well, why I write about Hosni so much, I'm basically writing this whole book about Hosni, or he's sort of the thread that sort of linked through it, because it was your question, yes. Yeah. Because I happened to find, these individual items turn up in Cairo flea markets very much. And actually, what I forgot to say about the flea market, there is actually much more to be said than just going to a flea market and buying. Because I've been doing this over the past 15 years, and I'm not the only one. Other scholars, other historians have been doing it. I've actually kind of, quote-unquote, theorized it in my first book. I speak of junk as archive, and the ways in which things turn up, and there are certain logics, including historical logics, and spatial time logic, why certain things turn up in certain places in the market, and where, and also in terms of social location. This is really archive. The flea markets for me is an archive of middle-class modernity, because poor people, if you want, did not consume print, did not keep diaries, and did not keep books, and elites, if you want, never. There is so much more knowledge of their social worth that they don't sell, they don't throw out their material. If a family wants to sell their papers, they would sell it through high-end dealers. Okay, it happens, right? So basically the Cairo Flea Market, and what I probably should have mentioned is that unlike here, Cairo has a very big network of markets with used paper. Nothing goes to waste, everything is recycled. So you can think probably of Paris, the bouquiniste. You know, you have a specific market. I don't know if there is a lot in England and London equivalent, but there are actually sort of specific markets, but they call used paper if you want. And it's not just the diaries. Mostly, diaries are only on the margin of the market. What is really what these markets are really about is about books and magazines and all kinds of used paper. And what I also see there through this archive is how people interacted with print. That's actually even probably more important, or sort of the way in which people interacted with printed material and so on. And sort of to the final question, yes, what happened to Hosni? I write about Hosni because I happened to, this was like a sort of holy grail of a historian, if you want. About 10 years ago, I found a dirty plastic bag with all his papers together. So I know so much about him. So whereby the albums, I have seen hundreds of them, not only through the market, but also in people's families, right? With Hosni, but people never show me other things, and they often don't have the diaries, because the diaries were often destroyed, or they were not meant to be shared, right? And even many of these albums were actually destroyed, anyway, there's more interesting things to be said again about the logic of preservation and loss and alienation I can't develop. But there are logics, by the way. In this plastic bag, these things came together. His diaries, his albums, but also his birth certificate, his marriage certificate. So I know what he was, what he became. He became a school teacher in a provincial town. And there's a whole, yes, I've always been thinking that one day when I finish the book, hopefully, then I will try to go to institutional archive and see what happened to him. But then, what if I find the family? Then I will have to return the things, maybe. So I'm waiting for it, which is fine by me. So I'm waiting for this, and I want this to be the postscript. Like what happened when I finished writing the book, and went and sort of what happened to him. But there are some suggestions. I think he didn't end up as a very happy person, and I think probably his life story. He will, he had all these dreams as a young person, and then I think he just ended up as a sort of petty school teacher somewhere in a province, And it's sort of, in a way, a story of sort of Arab modernity. So it starts with these hopes. Anyway, and very quickly about Latour. This is a brilliant question. It's funny that you picked on it, because the Latourian reference was there like a teaser. I was actually curious if someone would pick on it. The way I use Latour, I don't do it very often. And it's utterly inconsistent with many of my other conceptual apparati. Because actually a lot of the work that the way I understand studio portraiture and lots of these things is through, studio portraiture and photography is through Victor Turner and Schechner and performance theory. That's the things that really work for me. And actually Doctrinaire Latour or Deleuze and Guattari don't work for me. Or perhaps I just can't be bothered to read it, honestly. But no, I mean, that was it. But I think that there are some really interesting. So if I use it creatively, it works for me totally. The notion of something being rhizomic as opposed to arborescent works absolutely perfectly when I want to talk about cultural flows. And it helps me awesomely to destroy this whole idea of sort of unilinear arborescent flows of modernity that sort of diffuses and spreads and inseminates the rest of the world. Okay. So I'm using Latour selectively, if you want, or Deleuze and Guattari, actually. They would probably hate it, but it works for me, because just the final point, what really I'm interested in, I'm empirical. I'm an empirical person. What the things, theory only works for me when it makes sense, when I see it in my material, when there is anything helpful to sort of unpack and navigate.
But that's very Latourian. Latour would it's so empirical,
Okay, fine. And very quickly to Kate's question of the content, because what's going on in the studio, I mean, the studio is really what goes on in the studio, and these are liminal times and liminal places of social dramas. Okay, so I don't think of it, I see what you mean in spiritual selves, but for me these are social codes and social dramas. And of course what these women are enacting, women or men and so on, are sort of particular performative social codes. And there's a whole grammar of culture that goes on in these studios, because there are tropes. Women and men photograph themselves in particular, so there are really cultural tropes and cultural, codes that they enact. Would it be this cross-dressing? Would it be the Oriental woman? But most of them, and actually they are in a way the cross-dressing into a man and cross-dressing into the Oriental woman. These are the outer boundaries of their femininity. Okay, that's why it's so sexy and it's taboo also. But what's much more common in studios is enacting bourgeois femininity, modern bourgeois femininity, and there are of course all kinds of codes through which this is enacted. Of course, the idiom of the modern dress that you see here, the playful, but also the pious, the daring, and so on. This is actually photographs of one and the same woman. That's why I put it here. There's this idea of the ever multiplying versions of the self that I think is a deeply modern thing. Yes, about modernity, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. I am also, as a historian, very wary of making these separations, but I see them there empirically. That's the point. And I try to make these shifts come across the sources. So something that I sort of ran across very quickly, I tried to basically preempt your question in my paper, but I may have run very quickly. Of course, that representation, what makes a massive shift from earlier ways of representing a person, of earlier forms of portraiture in all cultures, by the way, is the demands that are placed on the image. So in the what I would call unmodern, non-modern, pre-modern portraiture or visual representation, the demand is that the picture captures a complete self, a complete soul, and a complete character. Okay? It's all supposed to be contained, and it's about presence. And then people, anthropologists of art elaborate about the notion of presence versus likeness, anyway, in a doctrinaire way, the presence is supposed to give lead into likeness. It's not quite as much, but anyway, it's all supposed to be in one picture. Whereas in modern representational practices, the self can never be contained in a single frame. That's the point. So it's ever multiplying. It's all about these performances.
Yeah.
I hope I've answered the question.